We are covering freaky pilot training stories. So if you have any you'd like to share, please do. And I'm just going to continue sharing some freaky flight training stories. Close to a check ride, practicing power off stalls. I had just done a few, and the instructor was going to demo one. He pulled the throttle to idle, and the prop stopped spinning. Ugh. He pushed the throttle back in. I hit the starter, and it came right back, and it worked fine for the rest of the flight. We landed and taxied it straight to the maintenance hangar. That reminds me of a funny one I had in a Piper Turbo Aero. As I was adding throttle and increasing RPM, the RPM needle actually fell off the gauge to the bottom on the glass. So I had no RPM gauge, at least to look at. It was still working, but there was no RPM gauge at all. Huh? So we're just sharing freaky pilot training stories, and we have a lot. And if you'd like to share some, please do. And I'm talking to you from Scottsdale, Arizona. Happy Friday. My lookout on my buddy flight while practicing under the hood didn't see another plane coming at us until she screamed. I took off my hood and saw I was headed straight at an aircraft that had broken into our training area without talking, and I had to do an aggressive turn away from him. It was extremely close. Here's another one. I was practicing some power off stalls with my instructor. He reminded me before the lesson to make sure that I was coordinated before going into a stall, following the procedure, etc. We immediately went into a spin as soon as the wing dropped. Obviously, my CFI is trained for this, but it was one of the scariest moments, especially since it was developing into a full spin very quickly. Good job for that instructor. And someone else said, I had this happen while reviewing power on stalls right before my private pilot check ride. My instructor caught it and stopped the spin after about half a turn. He said he didn't think I had kept the controls coordinated, which is why it happened. And he wanted to demonstrate the correct way to do it. The plane spun on him too. Then he admitted, maybe I was flying coordinated after all. We decided to book a different tail number for my check ride. Here's another one. I had a flight instructor named Brett. He was having fainting spells, but he didn't want to lose his medical, so he wasn't telling anyone. He was driving to work and fainted, crashed into road construction equipment and died. The next flight instructor they assigned to me was a douche, an absolute douchebag, complete safety salesman on the phone, and wouldn't deal with the fact that I'd already soloed and met all the requirements for my private. Just needed to take the oral and the check ride. I was scheduled to fly with him the next day and decided to cancel and go to a doctor's appointment instead. Around noon, my phone is blowing up. People are asking if I was okay, if I was flying. I knew something was wrong. I suspected a small plane crash made the news. All of a sudden, I'm getting all these phone calls. Turns out that the same douchebag flight instructor took off with a student with full flaps in a Grumman. Something you're not supposed to do. A plane he wasn't even checked out in either. He apparently caught the full flap takeoff at about 100 feet and pulled up the flaps. But the plane crashed and he died, and so did his student. Turns out he was a commercial pilot, but not even a flight instructor. He had passed the written to be an instructor, but never did the check ride or the oral. Maybe he had something worked out with the flight school, but now somebody had passed away. Of course, the school got sued. That's a crazy one. Here's another story. My first cross-country solo attempt, my engine had cracked a cylinder. I was about 3 minutes into my flight, climbing out, and I lost 300 RPM, and the engine ran really rough. Coordinated with ATC, who helped me divert safely, plane and pilot unharmed. He says that it spooked him for a bit. That happened to me. I actually had a cylinder head blow on a Cessna 152. If you're wondering what that looks like, well, after we landed and they pulled the top cover of the aircraft, if you're turning the propeller, you can see the cylinder moving back and forth. That's how you know that you've blown a cylinder head. The aluminum cover that covers the cylinders, you could literally see the piston moving back and forth. And of course, we had lost all oil pressure as well. But we were able to make it back as well. Here's another story. As a CFI over rural Minnesota, my student was doing lousy at 3,150 feet instead of 3,000. A few dots deflected off course as he approached the initial approach fix for an RNAV approach into a tiny airport in the middle of nowhere. I'm mostly focused on the student and the instruments, since my mid-air collision guard isn't exactly up in this situation. All of a sudden, I look up and I see a red and white low-wing aircraft at our exact altitude, within a foot, headed dead for us at the 12 o'clock position, a few seconds away from impact. I bank left, not what you're supposed to do, but it was almost instinct. He banks left at the exact same time, and we miss each other by maybe 50 feet. Never came remotely close to a mishap other than that time. The "it's a big sky" theory didn't hold up that day. Have any of you had any near misses? Let me know. I've had a couple. In the air. One time I flew past a bonanza in the Pacific Northwest, and I flew so close to the bonanza that I could see the pilot's Ray-Ban sunglasses. Literally. They were Ray-Bans that the pilot was wearing, and he was going the other way. Let's continue. Student pilot with instructor doing touch and goes. One lap right as we get off the ground. I mean, the millisecond we did it, a military helicopter starts flying right across the runway, as in perpendicular to the runway and right in our flight path. Instructor takes the controls and climbs us hard enough to where we miss the helicopter by maybe 20 feet. Below it, we'd be screwed by the wake turbulence, he told me later. Instructor immediately decided, screw this, training is over for the day. Let's go back home. Only time I ever heard him curse, ever. Let's continue. Instead of gently flaring, my student decided to rip the yoke control back and do an accelerated stall 50 feet above the runway at night. I'm always pretty defensive with student pilots at night, but that kid really tested my reaction time. Here's another one. Solo cross country for my private license. I was flying up the Lake Michigan coast, and it was time for me to turn inland back to the airport. I hadn't used the GPS yet, but wanted to do a direct too in order to get accurate distances for CTAF callouts. I started turning right while entering the airport into the Garmin and freaked out because I couldn't move the yoke. What's up with that? I pushed a little harder and harder and nothing. I was a bit stunned and tested the rudder. Just fine. Elevator? Also fine. I wondered if I should just try turning left. Maybe I only couldn't turn right. I thought for a minute, but I was afraid that if I turned left, I wouldn't be able to level off since I couldn't turn right. I started a slow rudder-only turn and imagined how I was going to land with no ailerons. After a successful rudder turn, I decided to see if I could turn left, since I was comfortable coming out of it with the rudder. I could turn the yoke left and back to the center, but still not to the right. I wondered what I should say on the radio. Should I call Great Lakes and declare to get eyes on me? As I reached for the radio, I felt a pressure on the yoke loosen. That whole time, my hand was frozen on the Garmin. My right arm had been resting on the left side of the passenger yoke. There you go. Some incredible stories. Another one, flight training at the airlines is called IOE, Initial Operating Experience. I was on IOE, and the first time seeing St. Elmo's fire across the windscreen on a CRJ 900 as we descended around some convective weather going into JFK was freaky. It was definitely a WTF moment that had me spooked for a split second before I realized what it was. Have any of you seen St. Elmo's fire while you've been flying? It's pretty common. You have to be near some convective weather and flying at night. Let's continue. My second lesson was this past September 11th. You know, the day that guy broke the presidential TFR and had military on intercept, calling weapons hot over guard. I about blank in my pants when I heard them make their first call to me. Well, we know who that was. Another freaky story. In instrument training, my instructor let me get myself into icing conditions, then said he was uncomfortable flying the approach back home from the right seat. Had to fly it pretty fast and without flaps so we could land without a tailplane stall. I didn't think much of it at the time, but seeing the inch of ice we accumulated after we landed kind of freaked me out a little. Have any of you picked up ice in your flying experiences? Let me know. That is kind of scary, picking up ice. Here's another freaky one. During my time as a CFI, extremely close call with another airplane while doing maneuvers. Close enough that I could actually hear the other airplane. When I was training for my private, I had lost my instructor to a mid-air collision. So I was quite edgy about that from then on. That close call scared me enough that I left the busy Florida training environment and took a job instructing in New Hampshire. Okay. Here's another one. We were coming in to land, short final on a runway that had a parallel runway. A 737 had landed on the parallel shortly before us. As we were powering back and gliding into ground effect, the aircraft started to feel unstable, then banked over 90 degrees, wake turbulence. If you don't understand wake turbulence, you will if it scared you. Being theoretical as far as wake turbulence understanding, I got scared pretty badly myself with wake turbulence up in the Pacific Northwest. Let's continue. I vividly recall the normally cool instructor almost yelling full throttle over and over. We went missed and took a minute to regain composure before landing. A reminder to respect wake turbulence. If you're landing behind a very large aircraft, how do you avoid wake turbulence? Fly above their flight path and land beyond their touchdown point. If you want to take off behind a very heavy aircraft and avoid their wake turbulence, rotate prior to their rotation point, and if possible, offset to the left or to the right before you turn your crosswind. Those are the best ways to avoid wake turbulence. And if you don't know, you can actually waive wake turbulence separation for aircraft as long as they're not heavies, unless that's changed. Let's continue. I had another CFI's pre-solo student try to pull up, idle, left aileron and right rudder about 200 feet on landing. When I told him I had the airplane, he said, "No, I've got it." Sounds like it's a fight for the controls. Oh my God, has that ever happened to you? I asserted again, to which the student said, "No," and then he swore. "I've got it." After that, I reached over and I hit him in the gut, took the controls, and I initiated a go-round. On the departure leg, I told him to sit on his hands until we got to the FBO. It was hairy and it happened quick. There was a plane holding short that asked if there was a CFI on board when we were on the downwind. Makes me wonder how bad it looked from the ground. I've never had to fight with a student like that. That is pretty terrifying. And by the way, I've given about 5,000 hours of instruction. So if you guys have any questions, please, I will try and answer them. If not during this live feed, provide the questions in the comments and I will get back to you, I promise. Here's another freaky story. I was going in to demonstrate a slip to landing. I throw the trim back, I pull back on the power, I put the plane into a nice slip. They're not saying forward or slide or side slip, I'm guessing a forward slip. And stay at pattern level all the way down the runway. Thermals, man, thermals. Continuing, I was on my first cross-country solo, and my last stop was Moses Lake, which has a ton of military activity, that's true. And also is where Boeing tests their planes. Did anybody know that? Anyway, I'm cleared to land on one of the longest runways, runway 32, because it's not particularly busy that day. As I put down the first notch of flaps, I hear air traffic control say, "Hold it, there's an F-18 coming at you the opposite direction down runway 32. That's my bad. Go ahead and make a left turn to 270. I glance up, and sure enough, there's the landing lights of the F-18 streaking toward me as it descends toward the runway. Slammed the throttle forward and got out of there as fast as I could. Made a safe stop and go on runway 4, which intersects runway 32. I took off again, passed by the F-18, which was still sitting on 32. It was a really neat experience. I learned that day that even experienced controllers make mistakes, and the controllers do make mistakes. Here's another story. Not exactly flight training, but I was a licensed pilot. You know what? I don't want to share that one. Here's one. On my third flight training lesson, I had a near midair. We were flying head on, but about 100 feet above. I was flying in a low-wing Archer. They were in a Cessna. My instructor never saw them as they passed below us and to the left, but I don't think too much about it. Pretty crazy. I nearly died before I even became a pilot. But after that, my head has been on a swivel. Another one. Almost was landed on by another plane once, and then had to do evasive maneuvers away from an F-22 on another occasion. So we're just sharing freaky stories, and we've shared quite a few here. Here's another one. First flight ever. At the hold short line, listening to Blue Angel 6 troubleshoot his emergency. A few minutes later, "Mayday, mayday, mayday! Blue Angel 6 is down. Pilot in the water. Send out search and rescue." Nothing happened to me, but it was still wild to hear it over the radio. That is pretty wild. Here's another one. Pre-solo days. I was with my CFI in a Cessna 150, practicing soft field emergency landings at a grass field. On final, 500 feet above the ground, the wind suddenly changed and entirely yawed the aircraft instantly to the left. You know how it takes you a few seconds to come to your senses, to realize what just happened? Well, it happened to me. It took me 3 seconds or so to come to my senses. I looked down at the ground to see what our ground track was, and we were literally flying sideways, still towards the airport. Our right wing was flying in the direction of our ground track. At the time, I believed the aircraft was going to stall and we would encounter a spin, and that our ailerons were entirely ineffective because of our sideways flight, and knew we had to get out of this. I looked at my CFI, who was staring at me calmly and collected, as if expecting me to do something. My young brain told me to use the rudder to correct, add power, climb out to recover. All of this felt like an eternity, which likely was more just a couple of seconds. That was a good one, and it was a good recovery. Do we have any more here? During my private, I was on a solo cross-country flight, and I got confused at an unknown airport in terms of which runway was which. So as I approached the airport, I started setting up for the pattern. And little did I know, it was the wrong runway. Oops. Came in with a slight tailwind with no issue, but I got on the ground after a hard landing, and for whatever reason, I decide I want to make it a touch and go. I learned a lot after that. They learned something. Hey, my door came open after takeoff. It was terrifying. Here's another one. I lost my voltage regulator on a solo cross country one afternoon to a controlled field. I did my required checks and turned toward home. But I was still freaking out. The other thing that was rather odd was on my second on check ride day, the DPA was insane. DPE, have any of you had interesting examiners, interesting flight examiners? This person is saying that their examiner was totally insane, didn't like my logbooks, made me rewrite entries, made me drive to the airplane owner's house to get the airplane logbooks, etc., etc. Things dragged on until it was late in the day in January, and we still had not flown. We took off in the evening, and I did my entire check ride at night. Wow. I love flying at night, so it wasn't a big deal. We did the standard stuff. The examiner tried to get me to fly through a military operations area. Has anyone ever had that happen? Oh my gosh. I was prepared, so there were no issues. She asked me to land at an airport about 10 miles from my home airport, and I did. Still, no issues. In the air, she said we could stay in the pattern and land to finish. She was lost. She didn't realize we were not at our home airport. When I left the pattern and started flying towards home, she asked where I was going. I said, flying home, and politely pointed out that we were at a nearby airport, not our own airport. The examiner was lost and disoriented, go figure. Needless to say, I passed, but my CFI was losing his mind, wondering why I had not called after the check ride. When I landed and she signed me off, I was so relieved. My CFI wondered if I had failed, if it was even a legitimate test. I'm pretty sure night VFR is a legit test, but I passed, so no issues. Good story. And if you have any freaky stories you'd like to share, please let me know. Here's another one. I was with my instructor about 3 lessons in. We were doing a simulated engine out. Throttled back to idle, set glide slope, and went through the checklist. The field we found to land in was my home airport. I made a beautiful landing and pushed the throttle in to take back off, only to have nothing happen. The simulated engine out wasn't simulated anymore. Luckily, it was close to the airport and not an actual field, which it would have been if it were a check ride. Took it to the mechanic to find a gash in the carb heat duct, allowing carburetor icing. That's why that happened. Another freaky one, a near midair collision. Happened near the beginning of my training. We were practicing power off stall, and I went in for a recovery. While recovering, a plane flew right across our windshield from the right, maybe 30, 50 feet above us. Have any of you guys had near misses? Let me know. Here's another one. The tower cleared someone for takeoff while I was on a fairly short final. Not too bad. if they're already on the runway, but this guy had to enter, turn, and accelerate, and the tower didn't even tell him to expedite. Plus, we had the fastest aircraft in the pattern that day. As a student, I was a little freaked out, but I went around and sidestepped so they wouldn't hit us from below. My instructor didn't say or do much, so I presume this was the right thing to do. At least I hope it was, because after the go-around, we did another circuit, and on the next final, the tower did the exact same thing. I'll just give you a couple more. We were doing stalls or something like that one day, and when I pulled the carb heat, it let go and came all the way out in my hand. Huh? Middle of winter in Atlantic Canada. We flew back over the highway and everything went fine. Maintenance said the next day that the carb heat was stuck in the off position when the cable snapped. Not the most freaky story, I guess, but I remember being like, what the heck was that? Here's another freaky one. I was soloing in the pattern and maybe had 24 hours at that point. The wind suddenly picked up like crazy. It was past my personal limits and official tolerances for the airplane too. I had gone around a few times already and was terrified that I wouldn't even be able to land. So finally, I'm coming in relatively straight. I get on the ground and a gust pushes me very near perpendicular to the runway. I swear, when I felt the airplane kind of shudder, then bounce, I nearly had a heart attack. I managed to save it, and I taxied off immediately. But I make sure I'm always on that center line now, and I swear my next 10 flights were just practicing crosswind landings with my instructor. Here's another one. Second pattern of the day, and my engine quit for about 5 seconds at 150 feet above ground level on the upwind. I almost had to use a taxiway for a dead stick, but the engine came back. Maintenance cleaned the spark plugs, but they still think it was just too cold for a little Continental 0300. Glider instincts were ready. I was ready to push the nose over in case I had to. Here's a very interesting one. I had a lightning bolt fire right next to our plane. I was getting my private. This was before special flight rules areas existed. The thing was, I started my training in February, so by the time summer rolled around, I had been calling the briefer enough for the dangerous combination that my instructor got complacent with me, but I actually didn't have enough experience to make smart decisions regarding summer hazards, like thunderstorms. For example, I had no idea what a convective segment even was. Anyways, the briefer ends with a VFR flight not recommended. Then the lightning bolt flashes down what seems like right next to us. My startled instructor nopes out, U-turn, and we land back at the airport where we hang out for a couple of hours and he teaches me about segments. That's one way to learn about segments and convective weather, huh? Here's another one. I think it was over 10 years ago. I was doing flight training out of Adelaide. It was a private pilot lesson on a cloudy day. I remember my instructor was doing the first few passes. We went round a cloud in a descending turn and we rolled out. I saw a movement at the rear of the plane and I looked back. It chilled me to the core. An air tractor was transitioning through the zone and flew past our tail. I swore I saw the pilot's helmet and his features. I yelled at my instructor who took evasive action. We cut the flight short and we went back home. Boy, did I have a hard time stopping my knees from shaking after that experience, that near miss. Here's another one. Beautiful sunny day and I was finishing up doing some solo stuff and I was about to enter the pattern. Made all the appropriate call-ups at the non-tower airport up to that point and I heard nothing back, so I figured I was all alone. Right. Looking down on the ground, I could see the shadow of my airplane and then another shadow of a plane right next to my shadow having no idea which shadow was mine. I literally did a double take and my heart was pounding. I had no idea where this other airplane was, so the only thing I could think to do was just extend my downwind and hope for the best. A few moments later, I saw the other airplane peel off onto base just below me. Whoa. It turns out he didn't have a radio installed and was completely unaware of what had happened. Within a few weeks, he did have a radio installed. I was so embarrassed for not having seen him, but from that point forward, I have a newfound respect for continually scanning for traffic and for any of you who fly at non-tower airports. At a lot of airports, radios are not required. So don't drop your guard. Keep scanning. Here's another one. On my long solo for private certification, my displays flickered on and off on my way to the other airport. There was also a lot of wind and heat causing turbulence that really bugged me, but I wasn't too fazed with that. What really shook me was upon final, my engine had failed. This was my third solo ever, and my engine had failed. Obviously, since I'm typing this, I landed safely and was able to get the plane off of the runway, but it was incredibly stressful. And after I finished training, I didn't fly a plane again for a year due to the anxiety flying had done and given me after that. It's a fun story to tell people about whenever I use pilot stories in conversation. I'm glad he wound up okay. Here's another one. Was on what was supposed to be my last flight of my tail wheel checkup. We left the grass strip I was learning at to head to an asphalt runway. It was a decent, dusting crosswind, but the instructor said it was workable. I tracked centerline fairly easily, but as we touched down, the wind had shifted drastically and caught the upwind wing. It was so fast that neither of us were able to keep the airplane on the runway, even with full deflection of the controls. Somehow, we managed to miss the runway lights, and the wing came within a foot of the ground. No harm to us or the airplane, but it was a good lesson. Here's another one. Instructor and I took off almost immediately. We could smell gas, and we saw some leaking from the left wing. He immediately called my airplane, and we went back around and landed. Checked with the school owner. Turns out that was just some known issue with that plane when you took her off. The vent would leak excessively? We weren't so sure. I'm glad I joined a different flight club a couple months later. Continuing, the second of 2 solo cross-country flights, and it happened to be a 3-point. Winds aloft said 20 to 30 knots with some turbulence, but surface forecasts and nearby ATIS said calm. The first runway is not large in either dimension, but I've landed it a few times before. As I'm crossing over midfield to loop around, I'm getting battered around by the wind. I start the loop back and begin a descend to traffic pattern altitude. There's nobody up. I join the pattern and I see that I'm crabbing at least 30 degrees. To maintain parallel track, still getting battered around, maybe even worse. I reduce the power a beam touchdown, and as I turn base, I'm fighting the plane in every axis. I see the windsock fluttering around, and the whole thing looks like the airport has a winds aloft at the surface. I decided, hey, there's no reason I need to land here, and this is stupid. I throttled up, and I head to the actually calm second airport of the journey. It took a bit of time to calm down from that, but looking back, there was no reason to freak out. It just made sense to divert. It was a good experience, but I'm glad I didn't try and land. That was some good judgment. Well done. My first solo flight, doing pattern work, I turned base behind a jet. I was sure I was above their flight path. I turned final and oops, guess what? I wasn't. I went straight into a 45-degree bank, uncoordinated. What did he fly into? Wake turbulence, invisible wake turbulence. I had plenty of runway and should have just stayed higher. I made that mistake myself years ago when I was a private pilot. Here's another one. Maintenance wanted a CFI to do a test flight for 172. They were doing some carburetor work on. During the run-up, I turned on the carb heat and the RPMs went up. I knocked it right back to the ramp. RPM isn't supposed to go up when you add carb heat. It's supposed to go down. The first student I ever set off for solo had just taxied back to the tie downs. As I was helping him push the airplane back, I noticed oil dripping everywhere under the cowl, like a lot of oil. I'm glad he made it back. I'll just give you a couple more and then I'll leave you to your Friday evening fun, okay? Several months back, I had an exhaust leak from our cabin heat. It was definitely an interesting experience. But a few weeks ago, I was doing another flight and we were doing a slip to landing. I had originally put the correct wing down into the wind, but my CFI told me that I was doing the wrong one and that I should turn the other way. Well, about 200 feet from the ground, we got a carbon monoxide warning and I could smell some exhaust, and that spooked me hard. So I got the airplane doing and immediately pulled off and told the tower about it without even thinking about what could have actually happened. Well, apparently my instructor told me to switch directions on the slip incorrectly, which caused the exhaust to flow into the cabin. Kind of annoying that I had my flight cut short from my CFI telling me to do something incorrectly. At least I learned something new, and CFIs, we make mistakes. It would be nice if CFIs owned up to their mistakes more often. Another one, my instructor quit to go fly skydivers. I was handed off to another guy who was just biding his time before an airline hired him. He was an arrogant rule breaker, and one of the things that really angered me was how he would never follow the procedure for handoff of flight controls. He would just grab the yoke. Well, one day he convinced me to rent a little bigger aircraft than I was used to flying, so my girlfriend could ride along. And then he spent the next hour or so low-key flirting with her while I practiced maneuvers. Oh boy. Coming in on final, we flew it straight into the runway at about 90 because each thought the other was flying, but neither was. The plane bounced back up into the air, shuddering, and I seriously thought it was breaking up. We did a go-round and landed. I shut it down, threw my headset on the seat, called the instructor every four-letter word I could think of, and quit the school right there. Once I got over being upset, I found a different school. It was cheaper, but they had a fleet of old rickety 152s that had been seen better days. They were slower than the other aircraft, and it really annoyed me because I couldn't see over the dash on final when the nose came up after I added flaps. Anywho, I hope you've enjoyed some of these stories that I've shared with you. I'm only going to share a couple more. I was on my first solo cross-country flight, and I looked to the right of the cockpit when I was settled and cruised and forgot to close the door from the inside. It was closed from the outside, but it just wasn't securely closed. And when it opens after you've taken off, man, it gets loud. Right about that. Here's another one. I was taxiing down to one end of the airport for takeoff. On the way down, we checked the pressure on the brakes to make sure we can stop and turn one way or the other. I put some right pedal in and it works. I put some left pressure to go back, but no response. I notify my CFI and try again. He tried as well, but no response. We ended up just rolling into the field off the ramp. We did a quick 180 and got back on, and then the connection came back, ended up taking off and did some pattern work. Maybe not the scariest, but it certainly startled me. Here's the last one. My instructor during a checkout thought I almost applied power too early during the power off stall recovery. So he was like, let me show you what happens when you do. He applied full power as the stall broke, and we went to a 90-degree bank to the left, almost entering a spin. I was pooping in my pants. He actually says something else, but I don't want to say that word here. But didn't say anything because he appeared to know what he was doing. On the bright side, my crosswind landings clicked for me as we did a few back at the airport. They are much better now. And I'll give you one more before I let you go for the evening. I was taking off heading back south to my home airport on my practice cross country, only about 38 minutes back. After I hit about 500 AGL, I started to lower my RPMs, turning off the taxi landing lights, etc. I then have the genius idea to turn on the autopilot as I had been instructed to do, getting some experience in using it as I had stick flown. I did not notice that the autopilot setting was on ALT for altitude versus VS for vertical speed. I hadn't noticed that. My autopilot pulled back so hard on the stick, you would have thought we were ready to go into space. Airspeed near instantly dropped. We went from 70 knots to 55 in seconds. I was correcting it, stall horn blaring, nose down, and recovered. To his credit, my CFI was probably scared too. But he saw I was correcting it, and he didn't interfere. Another one, porpoising landing within a 2-seat Diamond during private pilot training solo with an Airbus on a 4-mile final. Never said SHIT so many times in my life, but it turned out okay. Here's another one. I put myself into a spin around 2000 AGL on a solo flight during power on stalls. So do you want to avoid doing spins? Be sure you are coordinated when you're doing stalls. Here's one more. Night flight training. Oh, no, that was a different one. I want to thank you for joining me. It's Carlos PC 747 Friday evening, wherever you are. I've given about 5,000 hours of instruction. I enjoy teaching, but I don't teach currently. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments and I will answer them for you, whether you're a private, commercial, instrument, CFI, or whatever rating you may be working on. Thanks so much and have a great evening.